Hello, everyone. Welcome to my session on Don't Forget About the List Resource. Who am I? I'm Nicholas Lorenzen. I go by Nick. I'm the Director of Software Engineering on the Northwell Emerging Technology and Innovation Team at Northwell Health. My team focuses primarily on ushering in new technology and trying to solve problems within a large health system based in the New York City and Long Island area, and problems that have either been previously solved with inadequate solutions or not solved at all. Enjoy hands-on development and architecture, and really building cloud-native applications in the healthcare domain. I have over 10 years of experience in healthcare, and that's both on provider and payer side. The goals of this session today is to introduce and reintroduce the FHIR List resource. For some of you, this may be the first time you're hearing about the FHIR List resource. For others, you may have heard about it before or interacted with it before. But I kind of want to bring it up again because I think it's a resource that oftentimes we forget about. I also want to get you thinking about the FHIR List resource and other ways to aid in your application development. The list resource is highly flexible, which we'll see here in the next slides, and we have personally used it in other ways that may not be the traditional ways, but has really helped us speed up delivery for delivering value to our clients. What is the FHIR List resource? So from the spec, the FHIR List resource is a flat, possibly ordered collection of records. List resources are used in many places, including allergy medications, alerts, family history, medical history, etc. I put emphasis on the etc. As we're going to see in following slides. This is where we kind of push the limits of what the FHIR List resource can be used for. FHIR List resource can have a patient encounter, and practitioner-specific context. This can aid in workflows or state management of resources. However, it doesn't have to, which is quite interesting. So you can have a list resource that is patient-specific, regardless of an encounter, patient and encounter-specific for really scope to that patient and that encounter, that episode of care, right? Something for a practitioner, right? Or something that is not related to a practitioner or a patient at all, right? The underscore list search parameter is a really interesting search parameter that allows kind of for expanded search on lists, right? I'm not going to go into great detail of this as you see in this example. This is also not always supported in every FHIR repo, but something to definitely check out as you can create these lists of different things like patients or allergies or whatnot, and then search against them. And simply put, right, list resource is a great way to aggregate data. It's a great way to store some state management within a FHIR repo, and to maybe store data that is specific to a clinical environment, but not necessarily a specific FHIR resource. And of course, we have the actual object here. A couple things of note, right, is the subject, right? Obviously, this can be a patient group device. You have an encounter reference here. What's really interesting is the source property, right, which can be a practitioner role, even a patient itself, right? And then obviously the entry. And this is where we get a lot of flexibility inside of the FHIR resourcing, because this item can be any type of reference. It could be a list of lists. It could be patients, allergies. Again, the flexibility when compared to other FHIR resources is really strong. So anytime you have a list that can hold any type of resources, you can just imagine the type of possibilities that this thing can have. All right. So this segues into really kind of taking what we do with the list and taking it further, right? So could the FHIR List resource be leveraged further? Yes, absolutely. And we've done that. And one of the problems that and I wouldn't say necessarily a problem, but one of the things that we encounter when building applications that are using FHIR is that oftentimes we have to store some data, whether that's metadata, settings data for a particular user, in this case, like a practitioner, or even application style data, needs to be stored. It's specific to a clinical application, but we don't necessarily want to store it in another data store. It doesn't need to, right? It's not something that needs to necessarily be stored outside of FHIR, but it doesn't necessarily have a home inside of FHIR. So we've really pushed the list resource, not in a way where we're trying to fit data to it that really doesn't belong to it, but just to leverage its capabilities of being a list, right? As you can see in this slide right here, with that reference that can be any, we can really expand upon the flexible reference object, which has a display which shows a string. Now, at this point, it's a world of possibilities because that reference object doesn't necessarily need to resolve to a URL. It's an optional. The reference and reference element, URI element are not necessarily required, which gives us additional possibilities for use for things that aren't necessarily pointing to a specific reference with no FHIR repo. So one example, this is a real world example here. Obviously it's been scrubbed and anonymized, but this is used in production today. We use the list resources to store user data, right? In this particular example on the left right here, right, we have a very simple list. This is called an EMR patients list. And at Northwell, we have an EMR that allows a particular provider to create lists of patients that they work off of on a day-to-day basis. It's not a new concept. That list we can fetch out of the EMR using some APIs, non-FHIR APIs, and we can essentially cache that data and make it available in our application. And now we have that perfect integration interoperability between our applications and the EMR, where users don't have to redefine a patient list. So in this particular example, the entries are just simple strings, right? I have Formonti, which is a facility, or which is a unit within a Northwell facility. I have my cardiac patients and patients to see before noon. This is all sourced to me as the practitioner. And this is a really common example when we store thousands of these lists in our FHIR repo and update them constantly using patch resources and whatnot to basically cache the list of lists. Now, when a user opens up this list in the application, we then make additional API calls to the EMR to fetch what patients actually store here. Now, in a traditional way in FHIR, you would store these patient lists in FHIR, but that's not always possible. Right. So we're kind of finding the middle ground here. And in this particular case, this data, again, could be a patient list where that actual Formonti would be the name of the patient of the list title here. And then each patient reference would be there. But again, that's just not possible in our settings. So we've used it to store just simple strings that really point to other integration points, again, showing the flexibility. Another point here, maybe a little bit more contentious or non-traditional point here, right, is storing user settings, right? So in this particular very simple example, in our application, we have various sub-modules or sub-apps. So one of those sub-apps is a rounding app for interdisciplinary rounding, right? So as you can see here, we've defined in this JSON object that can be consumed by the UI on load of the actual user clicking the application. They know that the landing app should be rounded because this particular user or doctor, right, or clinician likes to start their day with rounding, right? And their color mode is start. This is very simple and try, but as you can see, I can nest inside here some details. I have only one item in this entry, but I could also have additional items that represent other settings or subsetting objects. So that data can then be pulled into the UI and that can be stored here, right? I've already have all of the practitioners, which are really our users, loaded into FHIR. Thousands of them, right? And now I can create these lists of settings and I'm really kind of consolidating my data down. Again, this is not really FHIR data per se, but it is related to a lot of FHIR data because this data here starts driving additional applications that pull even more FHIR data. Another example, and I think is a really powerful example, is storing application data. So this particular list, just to break it down here, right? This is an ordered list, and order isn't inferred or implied. It's not necessarily strictly put, or you can define it as saying ordered. But this is an ordered list for our UI component. So we actually have a UI component that is used by many different clinicians, right? So this list lacks a source. There's no particular person, place, or thing that this is relating to, other than we know that in the UI, when a page is loaded, then we need to call upon this list to get some details, right? The very first item in this list contains a query, and as you can see, this query has placeholders for string interpolation, where it reaches out to a FHIR server and it pulls back an observation code and a particular patient. And then the second item in this list, right, is an actual FHIRpath. We really enjoy FHIRpath. It's a great bridging parsing tool to bridges between development and some type of like business analyst or data analyst, right? So in this list, when we get this data or we get this list back into the UI, we know this is what we're going to go fetch. And then this is what we're going to display. In this particular case, we're just concatenating, right? Coding, display, and value together to just display. This is just a trivial example, but as you can see, you can have more examples here that really drive the UI. What's really nice about this is that you can track when things have been updated and whatnot, but we can make changes to this list and then see how it reflects in our UI without compiling code, right? So it's really metadata-driven UI components that are not attached. I would call this the more exotic or whatnot example, but a more exotic, non-traditional example out of all of them, but it really just shows you the power of a list. Nothing has really necessarily changed dramatically up here, and this data is not necessarily super important to it, but what we're doing is storing information to drive a UI. And by doing so, we can speed up our development times. So again, it's the idea with the list resource is highly flexible and can be pushed to a limit where if you're wondering, where do I store this kind of data that is clinical, maybe not clinical, related to an application? I don't want to necessarily have a bunch of data spread out amongst different databases or whatnot. I would like to consolidate as much of it as possible into FHIR resources. Check out the list resource because it can be used in very flexible ways as that state management or even that kind of configuration to drive application development. My contact details here. You can reach me through the speaker gallery or my email. And thank you very much for your time and listening to my presentation.
Hey everyone, it's Nick. Thanks for listening in. I got some questions here, so I'll just go down the list here and feel free to chime in. I think I got like 5, maybe 7 minutes left. So the first question was, do you require some kind of key to narrow the list, aka how do you handle my server, myfhireserver.com/list? So we keep it really simple. We use business identifiers to focus on what type of list to build off of, or on what type of list to pull. Again, it's not, we try to keep simplicity in play, and for things, we might add a parameter for a particular practitioner ID when we're pulling that data for a given practitioner. So I hope that answers that question. Next question, I knew this one was coming. Did you ask about this one on FHIR.chat.org? My initial impression is that this user is shown in the presentation would be an anti-pattern for list. Reference should always be a pointer to a resource. It's okay if you've got a display, but it needs to reference should good resource. Also asserting different meanings based on position, list is prohibited. Yeah, I did ask it. I didn't like the answer. I think you guys probably don't know, but my middle name is Bending Standards. I'm Nicholas Bending Standards Lorenzen. So yeah, Yeah, it is. You can call it an anti-pattern if you want. You're entitled to that opinion. I think one of the challenges that we have when we're building real-world applications is I'm trying to limit the amount of extra data sources and databases that I have to deal with. And I have this really awesome FHIR server that can do pretty much everything I need it to do, but not. So yeah, it probably is a bad anti-pattern. That's why, in the presentation, it was trying to get you to think differently. In my FHIR server, which is Google Healthcare FHIR server, and others that I've used, I haven't had a problem working with this, and it's been extraordinarily helpful in us developing rapidly and delivering value to our clients, which is really the name of the game, right? FHIR service check the referential integrity per every reference. If you put thousands of references on patients' medications, the pushing of the resource will take a lot of time if you need to update it from time to time. So we don't do this. In fact, our FHIR server doesn't actually have that underscore list capability. So yeah, you're not wrong. Physics is physics, and it can be very detrimental. Our list, I think our largest list that we have is about 100 items. And again, we manage it a lot outside of FHIR and then submit it back. Sometimes we do patch operations, but we keep our lists small. Did you look at using basic? We did. We did look at using basic. List was great, worked for us. For patient list specifically, can you talk a little bit about why list was chosen over group? Was there an inherent benefit for list with flexibility? This is a really good question. So yeah, no, I was just on the Argonaut talk for patient list because we have that problem. So we were looking at group and whatnot. So the problem is that our EMR, which doesn't really have FHIR, we have an all scripts EMR. We have a couple different EMRs in Northwell. Northwell is a little bit complex in that, but none of them have FHIR endpoints exposed yet on their current versions. So there's patient lists that are stored within the EMRs, and what we're essentially doing is caching those lists, so they're not storing the patients, and there's tens of thousands of them. So storing the actual list values is a really hard problem to solve that we're not really looking to do, but we can store the names of the list. So we're storing lists of lists, if that makes any sense. And the actual list we fetch through a legacy API at the time, and do some front end caching. Based on the Argonaut thing, if our EMRs expose FHIR endpoints, I definitely hope to go more towards the group setting. So yeah. Any other questions that anybody has? These are really great questions.
Yeah, just
was I on mute the whole time?
When you do a list.search with no parameters, what do you do practically?
What do you mean? Like we always have a parameter.
Do you give everybody anything, or do you throw an exception that says, hey, please narrow this down a little bit?
So we control, so nobody like searches for a list without an identifier. They're going through the UI. Like we don't have another application that's leveraging those. We're using those for our applications that we're building off of.
Okay.
Again, guys, this is just to get you thinking out of the box. I know standards are standards, folks. Let's think a little differently.
Well, yeah. Think about what you're going to do with those search parameters, though.
I mean, it works. It works for us.
Okay.
So, yeah. And again, if you don't pass search parameters, you're going to get a paginated list of searches, a list back. That's what our FHIR server does. So it's not breaking anything. Cool. Any other questions? All right. I guess that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that's the end of our time, Nick. Thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. I appreciate the Q&A. Any further questions, if you post them in Whova, Nick will get a notification and be able to answer them for you.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.